I'd love to get into it. I always think about, my grandpa gives me a hard time because I think he thinks pretty highly of me. And he says, the problem with society today is there's no men like you, he points to me, running and getting involved in politics. And I'd love to chat to you about why do we not, you could say, why do we, why do we, where are the Robert Schwartens and where,
I agree with you.
Where are the John Howards, agree with him or disagree,
Where are the people who want to take public office,
And what kind of environment,
standard of it.
What kind of standard do we, and is it a systemic issue that then sets them up to fail because of the media cycle and because of whatever? I don't know. I just love to hear what you have to say.
I actually don't know the answer to that, but I've got views about it. But I think there's a deterioration in the standard of people who want to go into politics, probably because there's better jobs around. You can get a lot of satisfaction from other sorts of public service, now, like what you do, like what my son does. He's a media. Both my boys are journalists, and they're one's in London. He's got a crackerjack job. He works for some mob. He basically subs all of the content from around Europe on mainly football, but it's for a gambling buddy. But the other bloke, he worked for AAP, he was the chief of staff and took a redundancy, and then now he manages social media for members of parliament, and he's also got a polling company. So that's where it sort of ends up in these days, and they get a lot of satisfaction out of doing that sort of thing. So I guess I never had any doubt that I'd be a politician because that was sort of an expectation. My father come from a long line of people who were political activists right back to the 8-hour day here in Rockhampton. My German ancestry was, they must have been political activists when they came out here in the 1870s, and he sort of slipped into that as well. And so he was a councillor on there used to be two councils here, the North Rockhampton Borough. So he was an alderman or a councillor or whatever they called him in those days there up until the 20s. So he was an activist in the first 8-hour day that was here. And my father was involved in the Labor Party trade union movement. My grandfathers on both sides were involved in it. So I understood from very, very early age that politicians make a difference. And I remember my father during the early 1961 recession, the postman, the old man was doing a job in the front yard. He was actually making a bed of nails for a showman who was coming to town, or who was staying in town, had come without his bed of nails, and the old man was making a bed of nails. And a bloke named Ralph Dunshall pulled up on his push bike. He was the postman. How you going? What are you doing, Evan? He said, I'm making a bed for Menzies, who was then the Prime Minister. And that direct link was that he was out of a job because of recession. And it's ironic now we're trying to avoid a recession in the construction industry, but in the early 1961, 62, it was called the credit squeeze. That was politically driven, same as Keating, the recession we had to have. So it's all cyclical, but it's all politically controlled too. So as my old mate Tom Burns used to say, from the day you're born till the day you die and thereafter and before, a politician somewhere makes a decision about you, how you live your life. So I never misunderstood that, and I'd like to think that I took that into politics. And we're in Bjelke-Petersen era, of course, and where there was plenty to be seen about the wrong examples of politicians and gerrymanders and all that sort of stuff. And the Labor Party was in a very bad place in the 60s, having come through the split. So I sort of cut my teeth, dare I use that word, having lost all my teeth in recent time on that. But as to why people today are not enthusiastic about it, a bloke said to me in the pub the other night, bloody politicians, they get paid too much. They were talking about, I think it was the New South Wales politicians or the Victorian politicians just got a pay increase. And he was going on about that. And I said, well, what do you think they should be paid? Well, he had no idea. I said, it's such a good job. Why is there, in my time, I think I stood for between local and state elections, I stood for 9 elections, only failed once. But in that whole time, there would have been, no more than about 40 people who put their hand up out of a population of, 100,000 people who wanted to run. So it's not a job that most people don't understand. I always said to him, you put your name in the ballot paper, you can be a politician anytime you like. And but I think it's got tougher now with the intrusion into people's lives, the 24-hour cycle. But it's got tougher for anybody in public life, like the AFL footballers today. I don't know just what the content was, but you could say the same thing about them. They're getting a lot more coverage than they should at the moment, or they want. But yeah, I think it's a good question you ask, that you need to ask yourself, why don't you want to be a politician? Because obviously you've got the talents to do it. And I know my kids won't want to be politicians because I spend so much time away from home. It's very intrusive in your family life. And I think one of the gravest mistakes that was ever made was they took the superannuation out of the superannuation incentive, which was based around a 3-term principle, because the average person in Parliament was 12 years was sort of the average time. I was there for 21 years, but that's more the exception rather than the rule. And so, you either get sick of it, get crook, or get chucked out. But the average is about 12 years. So the superannuation scheme was funded around that, and it was very generous to that end, and it brought envy. And Mark Latham was the one who got rid of it. John Howard warned him that if he made an issue, he'd match it, and they did, and they got rid of the superannuation, I think, as a result of that. The financial detriment that a lot of people would suffer going into it should they, lose their seat in three terms. And I'll give you an example. I was in Parliament with a fellow who was an inspector of police, and so when he lost his seat ultimately, he went back to the police service, but he went back as a rookie cop. So he lost a fortune in superannuation. And if you're the principal of, say, Rocky High School or a university lecturer here, you quit your job and the superannuation just the same as what you're getting here. There's no real what I would call comfort for your family that you're going to get another job straight away or whatever. And I really think that's been part of the disincentive of it. But certainly, there's never been a time in the history of parliaments that I've ever read in Australia or anywhere else for that matter, where there hasn't been remarks made about how unsatisfactory the politicians are. It's just like, from the time of Plato, they were talking about young people, not doing the right thing and all that sort of stuff, that the younger generation is worse than the current generation, all that's nonsense. And so I don't think that politics has ever been a great allure to people, but I think it's probably now there's better jobs around and a lot more of them that'll give you great satisfaction in delivering in public service. And I think that's got something to do with it. And until such time as we can find a way to incentivise a lot more. And what we've seen in Queensland, I think, is very regrettable. In the last 20 years, we basically had a brain drain. When Newman got in 2012, we were reduced to 7 members in Parliament. Then Palaszczuk got back and stripped those ones out. But when I went into Parliament, there were people who'd been there in opposition for 20-odd years who could mentor you through, and I think there's been a fair bit of that. And if you look at the federal government, Labor government at the moment, there's a great deal of expertise there because those people have been through the mill, whereas in Queensland they've struggled because on a Friday they were working somewhere and the Monday they were cabinet ministers. They didn't do that apprenticeship like I did through a term and whatever. So I think we've had a fair bit of churn through the system in Queensland, which probably people look at and say, well, I don't want to be part of that either. But it's not a very, why would you give up a secure job that, in 3 years' time or 4 years' time, you could be out of a job? And that did happen to me, of course.
Do you think that it's something to do with people feeling... It's a two-part question because I feel like people are more patriotic than ever in that attendance at Anzac Days and things like that's increasing. But do you think that people feel a smaller duty to country? And it should be viewed as the same as, say, military service, where we owe it to our country to contribute?
I think it was seen as that once, but I don't think it's seen as that anymore. I think it's just seen as another job. And I think that lack of commitment, I mean, you can't generalise on these things. I think most politicians that go in would go in for the right reasons. And that is that they either see something in society they want to improve, or they want to make an improvement and make their mark on what they think. And our party system allows them to do that through, while it's a handbrake on it to some extent, but, you know, there are certain things that I achieved as a cabinet minister in housing, in public works, and those sorts of things that I always wanted to achieve and I was lucky to achieve. But a lot of politicians don't get that chance because you go into opposition and spend. My predecessor, Levi, I spent over 20 years in opposition. He was not able to deliver. You've got to be in government to deliver.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So it's very, I don't think people unnecessarily, and I agree with what you say about the patriotism and so on. It's a lot more than it was. But I think there's a lot more scepticism too, and that's probably not assisted by some of the antics that we've seen from a minority of politicians in recent times. But that's always been there. There's always been, every job, of my father used to say, wherever you find money, you find thieves. So wherever you find power, you'll find people who'll misuse it. So I think that, just as there are crooked doctors, there are crooked priests, there are crooked politicians, there are crooked in every walk of life. But I think the fact that politicians are more in the public eye.
And their wages are paid from taxpayer dollars, technically.
Yeah, it's no one ever says that to a police officer. No one says I pay you. And I used to say to people, you pay my wages and I pay my tax higher than what you pay. So, but that argument is always there. A funny story was once I was going to Brisbane. In those days, they used to have business class, and I flew business class, and bloke got on. I used to, when I used to get on the plane at 5 o'clock in the morning, go to Brisbane to Cabinet every Monday morning. So wait out there for an hour, get on the bus, on the plane, away it'd go. Anyway, this morning, and I used to get really angry. People say, off on holiday, Schwarten, and then I'd look at them, they'd be in board shorts. And because the only time they travel was go on holiday. So I didn't take it to heart after a while. This one day they were sitting up the front of the aircraft, and the bloke come in loud as could be. He said, "What are you doing in business class?" I said, "Oh, well, there's no first class." And the mob all roared laughing behind me. And, it was just a big joke. I wasn't going to take it too seriously, and I don't think he meant it seriously either. But, they're the sort of jibes you get all the time. And I think you got to roll with the punches a bit. And luckily I had the personality, I suppose, in a lot of ways too. And I think you got to like people to be a politician, because you got to put up with a lot of things from people too. But from that end, there's a lot of, we only ever focus on the bad things in society. Like when there's a bushfire on or whatever, you see the great Australians come out. You also find a couple of weeds in amongst the bushes there. But realistically, we tend to remember people who do us a bad turn rather than those who do us a good turn. And most people are good. They really are.
Do you think people are too reliant or look to the government too often to solve all their problems?
Well, I think governments have encouraged that over the years. I think that's been, it's a two-way street, that, because I think society generally, there's an ad that comes on, and I won't name the company, but it says me, me, me. And I think that's being reflected out there in advertising all the time. You are the most important person. Never mind a bugger about the woman across the road with 4 kids who can't feed them and can't pay electricity bill. And we used to be a society once where, like my mother told the story of the Great Depression, no one starved because whatever food people had, they shared it. So if you had eggs, you'd share them when you could. If you had lettuces, whatever. So that collectivism, I think, went over a period of time when probably in those days women stayed home and kids stayed home and dad came home, or he wasn't working at that stage or whatever. But I think people are so damn busy now that they haven't got time to collectivise, and you see that through volunteerism and so on, that They just can't get people to volunteer. I think that people are now more time poor than they've ever been, and as a result of that, it does become about them, and you see a budget brought down, and the inevitable question is what's in it for me, rather than what's in it for the country. And politicians respond to that. They say, we're going to do something about the cost of living because Mrs. Brown or Mrs. Smith, is getting welfare, and so we should, as a society, do that. And I was rather taken back when the other day they said the recession was going to be fed by that we would end up in a recession because our lowest paid people were going to get a couple of bucks a week more in their pay. And I think that's the reverse side of it, because that's that sneering look at those who are worse off than ourselves, and I don't like that in a society. I think politicians don't do enough about getting people to understand that is a fundamental part of government, trying to make sure that those who can't help themselves, or those who fall on hard times, or because of things like a recession, as Keating once said, he knew that the recession was going to throw people into a pool of unemployment, and he knew that there would be those who would swim very easily across it and get jobs, but there were others who were going to plan it. It was their job, the government's job, to teach them to swim across it. And I don't think you can put it more eloquently or directly than that what the government's responsibility is in that regard. But in terms of personal responsibility for your own behaviour, just go up to a bloody public hospital and see people smoking outside it with one leg and so on, who then whinge about the free health system, or say that they've got to wait and whatever, where they don't see that obesity or something that they've caused is a fact that the taxpayer next door should be paying for. And I think that's human nature as much as anything, but I think we see a lot more of it.
Yeah, so people not taking responsibility and being too concerned with themselves.
Yeah, well, saying the government's there to help me. I pay my taxes, therefore I could smoke myself to death, and I want to jump the queue on somebody else who needs help simply because of of my own self-impact. Well, we all do things in our life that don't help us along, but the reality is that our health system, our free health system, is a very good system, but those are the people that complain about it the most. And I know from my years in politics that the people who come and bash on the Member of Parliament's door, a cigarette in one hand and drinking 20 schooners in an afternoon and obese, and saying, well, the doctor won't operate on me at the public hospital and it's my right to have, and all of this because it's a free health system, I pay my taxes. So I think there is that sense of entitlement by some people, but by and large, I think most people are pretty respectful of politics, I think. We tend to look at those, and the polls certainly say that to some extent. They've never moved much from real estate agents and whatever, but they know where to go when they want some help. And so I think that, I don't think anything's changed in that regard, but I do think people, because of all the devices that are in our life, you don't need your next door neighbour so much. You dial the ambulance and one turns up with $400,000 worth of operating theatre stuff in it.
Can I ask you a controversial question?
Should
there be an ambulance levy in Queensland?
Should there?
Yeah, like you have to pay $99 to have an ambulance come to pick you up.
Yeah, well, there was that. We had that system prior to the one that we currently have, which is publicly funded, and it didn't work because people just didn't pay it. They just hadn't, if the ambulance came out and they weren't a member of the ambulance, they'd have to chase them. So it used to be a subscription-based ambulance system. And most decent people did, but then there was people who didn't. So it got to the stage where, the ambulance came out, we got paid, and now it's free. People, I think, and I tell you what, back in those days, I was actually working for Tom Burns when we introduced the mandatory training in ambulances. We turned the whole thing on its head, and it went from being a voluntary-based funded system to a publicly funded system. Over a period of time, but there would never have been under those circumstances the sort of ambulances that we have. with highly skilled paramedics turning up saving lives every day. And I mean, the demand for it is just going to keep going and going and going. And I don't know what the solution to our health system is, but, when I went into Parliament, it was $2 billion. Well, I think it's $30 billion now. And the cost of provision and the cost of plant in those hospitals is just extraordinary.
Do you think that it's really challenging for a government, I'm sure, and we say government, but these are people, and they've got lives. And so you touched on the healthcare system there, or even education. How long should we continue to fund without major reform something like health and education, which does so much great work? We have a great public health system. We have great schools. Health outcomes seem to be declining. And say, let's even educational outcomes seem to be declining in terms of, illiteracy rates are higher and increasing. But we're putting more funding than ever into these programs. How long do we go doing that before taking major steps to reform them?
Well, the second point I'll get to first is the education. As a former teacher, I wonder how some of this stuff has arrived at us to say that we're stupider now than we were in my era. I just don't see the evidence of that. I mean, wherever I've been in the world, and I've been fortunate to travel a lot of places, you will find Australians somewhere in a key job. We lead the world in science. We lead the world in education. What I'm saying is in research. And I had ulcerative colitis when I left Parliament, and I was lucky to be in Queensland because one of the best in the world, Dr. Martin, was able to operate on me. And now he leads the world in this regard. And he's a product of a public school in Queensland, and he works in a public hospital system as well as the private system. But he's a very unassuming fellow. And so, I challenge the statistic that says that we are stupider now than we were 20 years. I think one of the problems now is that the dissipation of, let me say, lower-end jobs that enabled people to leave the education system earlier and develop into different beings through a variety of other sources, that's gone. And we're now seeing people stay in our education system for longer and not get a good outcome out of it, simply because when I was a young bloke, class, I can remember this like it was yesterday. 14-year-old, this kid got an exemption from Rocky High to get a job in the meatworks. And away he went, and we are still friends to this day, him and I. And he spent his entire life working in the meat industry. Now, he wasn't good at school, but he has, matured into somebody who, he's probably very immature and he's learning and whatever. He's as smart as paint. He's got more money than I have. And he has had a very successful life of employment. But those jobs don't exist anymore to any great extent because it's now, no one sits down with their kid and says, like that kid's father was a meat worker, and an opening came up, put it in a good word. Now that bloke, same kids, not one of them's a meat worker. He didn't want them to be meat workers. They're a variety of, one's a tradesman, one's a nurse, one's a chemist. So no one sort of he didn't push his kids down that path because he saw the benefit of education. But for every one of those, there's another group of families out there that have never had employment. And why would they have it? If you've never seen your parents go to work, if you've never seen your grandparents go to work, you've got a welfare system that is there to protect you, I suppose, but what sort of job could you get? And I read a very alarming statistic the other day through about vehicles. They say that by 2035, there will be 200 million unemployed drivers in the world because of AI and all the rest of it driving. Now, that's your bus drivers, taxi drivers, all those sorts of things. Now, I don't know how accurate that is, but there's a whole area that would have been available to people with limited education, arguably very skillful people, but what's the opportunity for that cohort going forward? And I think one of the big challenges for politicians is going to be, how do you tap the world's wealth to ensure that there is meaningful employment for those people? And there's plenty of jobs out there in volunteers. People don't volunteer anymore, like your rural fire brigades and all of those sorts of things. And they're going to have SES. They're going to be paid positions. Where are they going to get the money from? The reality is that I could point to a couple of individuals in Australia that banked $10 or $11 billion last year. What are they going to do with that? And so I'm getting off the track a bit with the education, but my view of the education system is that it has always tried to keep up with what's happening in society, but the societal has jumped ahead of it in leaps and bounds, and it's almost back to the Industrial Revolution, where you saw when they went from a feudal system to an industrialised world, people literally starved because they went from being provided with a sustenance of living, subsistence living, of being fed by the master, basically, to starving because they couldn't get a job. And out of that came, all of your basic rights of employment, unions, and all of that sort of social welfare stuff. But that took 50 years. Society's not going to wait 50 years. These people won't wait for 50 years to be, to be picked up from the ground floor up. And I think some of the stuff that you're seeing around the world at the moment is an indication that there's a whole group of people out there that are very unhappy with what the future's got and the education system delivering them. And then that manifests itself into the health system, of course. Bad education outcomes, bad health outcomes.
I believe that strong families create strong communities. And so I think some of those educational outcomes or career, opportunities and things like you've just outlined, people, now second or third generation not working, unemployed, never have worked, grandparents didn't work. That results from a family unit type of environment that is potentially fruitful. Yeah,
exactly. And at some point, trying to intervene in that, and I volunteer at Rocky High every Friday, so I see some of this stuff. I work with a group of, troubled kids, I suppose. We make timber products for Capricorn Animal Aid. I don't have any trouble with them. They're great kids. But when you hear the stories, one little chap said to me that his grandfather was going to jail and he was very delighted about it because he raped his sister. I thought, what a great life I've had. When you talk about a family unit, that's your family is the same. They're just unheard of. But he just told me that matter-of-factly. And so, again, that's always been available, but he's living with foster parents and so on. And his only hope of getting out of that problem is through education. And what he gets out to is, very much the impression and the support he's going to get from other people, not necessarily from his family. And that sort of, as you say, the family unit, when it ruptures, it does terrible damage into community. But where you've got intergenerational unemployment, intergenerational poverty, and basically subsistence living, those people still survive, but whether they steal, and that's what they do in a lot of cases. They, intergenerational theft. That's all they've ever seen people do, and they'll do it themselves. And anybody who's read Dickens, the Artful Dodger and all them, that's what that was all about, a lack of family, so they all ended up in the poorhouse. And I think there's an element in our society now where we're approaching sheer poverty, and it was great to see the other day when they were talking about increasing, not welfare payments per se, but low wage jobs, because when you work and you're getting $22 an hour and you're working your guts out and you still go past somebody sitting on their ass at home and not working, you probably say, well, why am I mug doing this? And I think that's another side to it. And But again, it comes back to political leadership. That's why I was in politics, to address those things. And I guess I'm still frustrated when I look at housing and all those sorts of issues that I sometimes get like a goanna bite that rears every 12 months and say I want to be back there. But the reality is I couldn't do any better than I did then and wouldn't do any better than now, because although there's a lot more money around now for it, the problems are just as big. How do you get people to go into the construction industry? We're 18,000 short. Why don't people want to go into the construction industry anymore? Well, because they can get a better job where they don't have to be an apprentice on low wages. It's one of the reasons.
You touched on it there. Youth crime's pretty topical right now, if you're happy to talk about that. Again, I think people are looking to the government for reform in some factors, which I think, you're part of the Labor government. You can share whether or not you think, they talk about the bail conditions and things like that, which may need to change. I also think there is personal responsibility on, again, talking about the core, looking at the core of the family unit. Not saying the government needs to put their hand into that thing or not, but they kind of have been for a while anyway in certain capacities. There's a responsibility on the individual to raise good kids.
Yeah, there are, but the case that I use where they stole our vehicles, the chap was born in Warrabinda, didn't know his mother. Knew his mother for 4 years. She died of alcohol and drug-related issues, probably domestic violence. Didn't know his father. Father's not on the birth certificate. Raised by an aunt with 9 siblings in Blackwater. You can imagine what that was like. And left school is the colloquialism they use. Probably kicked out of school at 14, semi-literate, fetal alcohol syndrome, whatever they call that. And you look at that and you say, where can I point to here the solution to that? And it's probably go back one step to the mother's mother, and looking at that whole of, it's too late, he's at the bottom of the cliff. I don't know what you do to him. And I was going to address the court, but when I saw him, he was well-dressed. I stared him down in the court. I thought, well, I'm going to do that. And I knew what I was going to say, but when I heard all this read out, I thought, what could I say I do to him that hadn't been done before? He wasn't frightened of going to jail, but he was clean, he was well-dressed, and he was quite well-mannered. He covered his mouth when he coughed and all that sort of stuff. Someone had showed him something. But I thought, how do you retrieve him back into society? And I don't know. I think he's a discard. And regrettably, he killed his own sibling, rolled the car over them. He was warned that day by the magistrate, you will kill somebody or you'll kill yourself. Well, sure enough, he killed his own brother. And he said he didn't have much of a life anyway. That was the comment. So to get back to your point there, I think that the earliest we can intervene in those circumstances, the better. Now, it may well have been if we could have fostered that kid into another house before his mother died instead of going with his aunt. I think this whole thing of family unification in Aboriginal communities is something that needs to be looked at, because I've seen enough of that failure. And my own view, those Aboriginal communities are, one of the reasons I support The Voice is that I'm hoping that we will get a voice in this nation that wants to get rid of those abhorrent communities. I mean, they were set up to put the Aboriginal people out of sight and out of mind, collectivise them, throw them from different clans all together and expect them all to get on. Well, they're under the heavy heel of the church for 20, 30 years, and some say they're better off under it. But more than that, probably 50 years. And ever since they've had self-government and so on, I'd challenge anybody to go into those communities and tell me that they are a great opportunity. But at the moment you mention it to any of the elected people in those communities, you're being racist if you suggest that there's a better outcome for their kids to be out of those communities. So I'm hopeful that a voice that is far removed from just going there and asking the elected people what they think, because they've got an interest in it, that in this nation, hopefully in the next 50 years we'll do better than we did in the last 50 years of just continuing to piss bloody thousands of billions of dollars against the wall and keep repeating them. And it's not all about Aboriginals and youth crime, but it's certainly a significant part of it in this part of the world, and we've got to face up to that, and that's a result, in most cases, of the destabilisation of Warrabinda. people, being kicked out of there and coming, drifting into here and drifting into crime. And at some point, we want to start to do something different. I think the boys, to just get off the subject a bit, is something that's different in that regard. But I really do believe that what the Queensland government's now doing in trying basically, and I think other governments, I heard a story in South Australia, basically going to the hospital where the child being born of an at-risk is the way to go. That's where it's got to start before the child goes to school or anything else. If there's intervention required, and you've got to be very careful that you don't end up with a stolen generation again.
I was just going to say that.
Yeah, and that's what people argue about, when you say don't put Aboriginal people with, when you advocate, as I do, that Aboriginal kids should go to the best family that's available, not necessarily an Aboriginal family. You're getting plenty of blues with people who argue against that, and I've had that argument for a long, long time with people. But I understand where they come from in it too, because, if you were taken off your parents when they were actually doing a good job, you'd be pretty cranky on it. You wouldn't want to go down that path either. But I think the overall issue is that it's not race-related necessarily, but it's the mere fact that Aboriginals are the poorest people in this country, or amongst the poorest people, the worst educated and all the rest of it. Poverty is the issue, whether it's poverty of opportunity, poverty of parenting, poverty of money, which overrides the whole lot. It's an issue that we really, and just throwing money at it is not going to solve it, ironically enough. Because if money was going to be the solution, the money that we have thrown at Aboriginal, and it's not just here, First Nations all over the world, where they've been dispossessed. Ironically, in South America, I noticed that wasn't. I've been to a lot of other places like South Africa where people are dispossessed, in northern of Canada and so on, and you see public drunkenness and a variety of homelessness and so on. But you don't see that so much in South America, because the Spanish went there and they weren't interested in taking the land of them. They just wanted the gold and the silver and worked the guts out of these people and killed them, basically with mercury and everything else. But you can go to, in Bolivia, we went to a village that people were living there connectively for 1,000 years, so they could trace the whole. So there's something in that, I think, too, but we can't put the toothpaste back in the tube there either. But youth crime is, I think, as I said about Dickens, if people can get to learn how to steal, they will. And, if you read, as I have, all of Dickens, you find what motivated him when, all of those people that were working, those young pickpockets and so on, they were under, what was his name, Fagin. He was the Trump, he was running these kids, and we're not far off that in a lot of cases here.
If you're happy to touch on The Voice briefly for another minute, I've sat there and listening to the debate that's going on, and I think by calling it The Voice, it makes it sound like there's not a voice to Parliament already, when the government's hasn't made no effort to listen to First Nations peoples over the last years, with designated people within MPs and at a federal level, and then community organisations and funding all kinds of different community programs. So I'm confused as to why giving the government more power is the solution to a problem that hasn't been solved through people dedicating their lives to this and huge amounts of money.
Oh yeah, and I think that's a valid point. I think that much of what people are concerned about is what you just said. And it's a concern I have too. The way I look at it is that we have pretty much tried everything else. We've certainly got Aboriginal people now into Parliament, and that hasn't changed things, because in my view, I hear the lady from, what's her name, from Alice Spring.
Jacinta Price.
Yeah. She talks about my people. Well, she's talking about a group of people that still live in these mission-type situations that then gravitate into major centres like Alice Springs and get drunk and make pests of themselves and so on. Now, I've got no doubt that the Northern Territory government, the federal government and everybody else has put programs in to help those people. And every every welfare group in the world has descended on there and said, you must do this, you must do that, you must help these people. But I really don't see any innovation to this thinking for a long period of time. And I think a lot of it's to do with, I remember ATSIC, where it was set up as basically a commission with government responsibility. They had their own funding, they funded housing and all the rest of it. It was a disaster, simply because there was no accountability in it, and you dare not. And they spent billions on it. And there's some other organisation now that is funded by the federal government. I've never heard of it, $2.5 billion. And you say to yourself, what do these people do? So I think, I don't know where the term voice came from, and I don't particularly like it, but what Peter Beattie created in Queensland, and I thought it was a good idea at the time, was similar to that, in that all of the mayors of these communities, he created a round table with all of those. So they came together with ministers every quarter, but we were all allocated a community, and our directors general were all allocated. So we had Palm Island, for example. And so my director general, Mel Grierson, went there many times directly to address some of the issues that they had. You might remember they burnt the police station down there, nearly killed a couple of police. So we had it at that time. We built a PCYC there, and it took 2.5 years just to get native title clearance, because the native title holders do not live on Palm Island. They were kicked off to build Palm Island. So a lot of the trouble that you see on Palm Island is to do with, it's a false community. But you go there and listen to the people. And I remember once we were there and they were wanting us to get the army in to clean all the broken bottles up from under the wall. And I said, bugger this, you threw them under there, go and pick them up yourselves. And but it had got to that stage where, if you listen to that voice, well, I don't think common sense prevails. And I think that showed, yet they did have a legitimate problem with their wharf, and it was under state, federal, local. It was just a nightmare. No wonder they couldn't undo it, but we actually got that solved, or Mel did, by bringing in the feds and whatever and cut through. And to some extent, they identified the problem and we identified the solution on that. But that had troubled that community for 30 years. And it meant, the cost of bringing supplies and all that over trebled, and because they had waiting out. And it was a very practical completion. But did I think that system worked? No, it didn't, because, and you could say they had a voice straight into Cabinet, which they did, every minister. We had to report to Cabinet. The Director General had to report to us. So, when you talk about having direct access to Cabinet as being a problem, it was never a problem. But did it solve problems? In some cases. But did it really make things better? I don't think so. And the reality is, because each one of those mayors was speaking with a voice on behalf of his community, or maybe on his own behalf, or maybe just the council's behalf, but no one's collectivising and saying, look, the problems in Arakoon are the same as the ones in Doomadgee, the same one. And really, the problem is that we probably shouldn't be here. We should be somewhere else. And I actually was responsible for shifting over 100 families at their request out of those communities into successful, I think we had 2 phases or something like that. But did they want me to do that? No way in the world. Their voice said, no, we want these communities to stay here because this is what we know. So what I'm hoping that comes out of this is that in the next 50 years we get educated people who can look at this Aboriginal consistent failure of law, of poverty, of lack of education, of imprisonment and all those things, and say, without being representative of those people, that we know we can talk on behalf of the collectivism, not individuals. When I heard, I think it was Warren Inch say the other day, my people don't want it. He's talking about those mayors and so on. They don't want it because they are quite happy to have their voice heard by their politician. And so I think that's a problem. But I did hear a bloke from one of the families up on the Torres Strait who's supporting it, and he said, the biggest problem with politics, the government's changed, the policy's changed, and we don't know where the bloody hell we are. as a result of it. So he was hoping that you'd get some consistency out of it. And, I honestly think the voice is going to fail. I really do. I can't see it getting a majority in a majority of states. I think there's too much mud, not enough water. And I think that the Aboriginal people themselves are, not convincing, because some of them are going to lose power out of it. That's what they see, that they're going to lose their voice to a collective voice. It's quite, and to hear Bernie say yesterday that she wanted advice on housing and health and education, they were the key areas. That's not going to come from out of those communities. That's going to come from people who are aware of the problem, have ownership of the problem, and it's going to come back to what we started on, education. I mean, I'd challenge anybody to find a leader that's come out of those communities since Noel Pearson, and I don't have a high regard for Noel Pearson in this. He's very divisive in what he says, calling another, advocate there a bedwetter the other day and all that. They wonder why people don't want to vote for it. When you hear that sort of bullshit, it's,
Thanks for the perspective. Yeah. I think it's interesting, and it'll just be interesting to see how the debate unfolds.
Well, I'm certainly not going to pick out people who are running no case or whatever and say you're wrong or whatever. I think we've got to rise above that and have the argument. And I'm quite happy to have that argument, but I won't tolerate people who just say, I'm voting no because they're black, basically. There's an element of those people everywhere. There always is, and so on. But someone like the argument that you've just exposed, I've had that argument with rational, decent people who scratch their head and say, what's all this about? And as I say, there's too much mud in the water and there's not enough clarity, and I think it'll fail for that reason.
But we'll see. The conversation will continue. And
I think what I heard Bernie say yesterday was the most sensible thing I've heard any politician say for a while. And I think, that some of the glib lines like, if not now, when? Well, the answer if you're saying no is never. I said that to one the other day. Asked me that question. Well, I don't want it, so never. Doesn't matter. Yeah. I wouldn't be asking that question.
Yeah.
I think we've got to do better, that's all.
All right, so why I may have alluded at the start of this conversation that I would never, not that I would never get involved in politics. I'm pretty open-minded to that in the future. I think that, I'm not even 30 yet, so I think...
And I think you just hit the nail on the head. This nonsense of people going into, get more young people into Parliament, I think is fraught. Now, I was, 35 when I went into Parliament. I'd had various jobs. I knocked around a fair bit beforehand. Now, there's certain examples like Katie Jones, who worked with me, very successful politician, and now has retired out of it at the age of 40. But I think the temptation of people to go in there and stay for a long time like used to happen is still there. But, I wouldn't be encouraging anybody to go in there until they got a family responsibility or whatever their domestic relationships are like and all that, really welded down. And I went into Parliament with two really great blokes, members for Maryborough and Harvey Bay. They were in their 50s and they were very accomplished businessmen in their own. One bloke owned a sawmill, self-educated, the other bloke owned a drapery store, and they'd done all sorts of things, and they were just in their glory. They were great local members. They brought a wealth of experience into the Parliament, and they enjoyed the job. And they stayed there till, I don't know, in their late 60s. And so I don't think there's, I think the one thing you need in Parliament is variety. You don't want all the same sort of people with all the same sort of age groups. I think, there's always room for some young maverick coming in, but there's always room for someone who's been out there and, got their hands dirty in their own business or, working. I think I'd highly recommend to you. I mean, you've obviously got the intelligence to do it and the presentation to do it. And you like people, so there's three things. But it's not. I always look at it this way, and I probably should have said it. I never looked at it as a job. It was a commitment. And I think if you look at it as a job, you'll go off your bloody rocker because you can't write if you wrote a training program for it and they've tried over the years, it's just, unless you like people. And I've seen a couple of examples where people have gone to there and don't like people. And they've had a hell of a time out of it. It's just been awful. And so I think you've got to care about your fellow human being and you've got to not take yourself that seriously. And, you know, I think there's a lot of thin-skinned politicians around. I mean, I think they're trying to turn the parliament into a mausoleum where you can't take the mickey out of one another. Vaughan Johnson and I were the greatest of mates, and he's no longer with us now, but, you know, he was LNP, I was Labor. Well, he was an old country party bloke originally, but we'd get into the parliament every morning, we'd have something disrespectful to say to one another. One morning I remember the prayers, and we just said the Lord's Prayer, and he said, "Have you forgiven people for their trespasses today?" I said, "Don't lead me into temptation." And the whole parliament just erupted with that laughter, you know. So every day we used to call one another names and so on, but parliament should be, in my view, just respectful, if that makes any sense. I mean,
yeah,
human nature being human nature, you get people in there who are passionate about their views. They're likely to say some things that you mightn't hear in church, but I think that's more power to them.
Yeah. So should people view? I like the idea of running for local government, state government, federal. Let's say you ended up in running in a local election like that, and doing a term, finding out if you actually enjoy the job. We spoke earlier privately of someone who had gotten in and then it didn't really suit them.
That's right.
And maybe you're great at it, and maybe you make a great contribution and you do a term or 2 or 3. So what's that, 12 years, 9 years or something, depending on the seat that you get. And then you move back into your other job and move on with your life, and you do your service and you contribute to your local community. Do you think people are viewing it too much like
I've got to be there for life?
A career, a career politician, and is that what people don't like?
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I suppose you could judge me as a career politician, I guess.
I'm not saying anything's wrong with that either.
No, I'm not. No, what I'm saying is, but I looked at it as a career. It was what I wanted to do, you know, at the end of the day. But there are other people who would see it, and I have seen this, and say, I'm here to do I'll give you an example. Anthony Lynham, highly qualified vascular, you know, the people who do this stuff around you that I'm getting done at the moment. What do they call them? Surgeons.
With teeth and stuff?
Your whole head, you know, your facial, macrofacial, you know, rarest hen's teeth. Anyway, he went into Parliament. He had an issue about alcohol-driven violence in nightclubs, because he was called in the middle of the night to patch young people up, and he went into Parliament, and he was able to. He went into opposition. He won a seat in opposition, and then he became a cabinet minister in the first Palaszczuk government, and then he got out again, because he said, I actually, you know, well, there was 2 reasons for it. One is that in order to maintain his qualifications, he had to still keep operating. And there's, you know, John Paul Landbrook, he's a dentist, he's the same, you know, he's had to keep doing, and because they want to keep their qualification, and that's fair enough. And we need them too. And Dr. Flegg was the same. But this bloke made up, and I was there when he made his decision to get out. He said, I wanted to be a politician and wanted to achieve things, but I also wanted to be a doctor. And I've chosen to go back to doctoring. And I thought, well, good on you, because you set out to do something. And Kate Jones is the same. She came in, she got defeated by Newman, then she got back, and she had an agenda way back in the days with me about involving more young women in Parliament. And when she saw more young women, she's now on the NRL board, having, you know, and doing a great job there, and various other things she's involved in. So she's 40 now, and she's gone back. So I think there's room for both. But I think the way the system works, even within parties and with nominations, I don't think we spread the net wide enough. I think parties, well, particularly the Labor Party, I can talk about that because I can't talk about the others, but I think the way we get candidates needs some revisitation. I think, you know, the days of going to a branch meeting, it's no longer relevant. People do not engage like that anymore. And so you say to someone, you know, you've got to join the party, you've got to be a member for 3 years, you've got to be this, that and the other. It's a deterrent. Whereas, you know, in my case, I built up my reputation through party activity. I'm involved in every section of it. But you don't need to, and you won't need to in the future. And I think, like any job, we should be out recruiting and saying to people, look, in 3 years' time, Robert Schwarten's going to retire. What about, some contingent? What do you think? You like, and you have a panel of people who, why do you want to be a member of the Labor Party? Why do you want to be in politics? Whatever. And I think we've got to do something innovative because, going along to a branch meeting, that'll turn you off joining the Labor Party, because it's got people my age there and they're talking about, the local member comes along, makes a report, and then it's not necessarily anything that, it's not going to get the person off the backside and say, well, I'm going to fight, but there'll always be people like me in it who've been brought up, and I think there'll be fewer of them, and I think there's fewer of them now. There'll always be in the Labor Party people who'll come up through the trade union movement, although it's not the movement that it once was, but that's a natural progression. But what I'm also finding that there are a lot of people who have been involved in a variety of small businesses who are now looking at, how does politics interact with them and how do they make a contribution to their sector, as it were, in small business. You've got to remember the Labor Party was formed on small businesses back in the 1800s. If it was just from the shearers' strike, like people fancifully say, they would have never got into government. But they had a lot of people like small farmers and small shopkeepers and people who really did it tough in those days. But because if the worker did it tough, they did it tough. And you found a whole group of people who were like shearing contractors and those sorts of people, building contractors, who were involved in the Labor Party. And it has always been the party of small business. The Liberals were always the party of big business, but now they say we're for the... And the Country Party, of course, was hived off really from the Labor Party more than anything else, rather than the Liberals. They're not Liberals. And, of course, now you've got the Greens who, they are pretending to be something that they're not. I mean, the fellow the other day, the housing bloke who was exposed as saying, he's the bloke in Griffith, okay, he's got a hyphename, Max Chandler, I think his name, something like that. Anyway, he proudly said, look, if we sign up to the $10 billion for housing, we're going to lose our activists because we'll achieve it. So we're going to keep voting against it. And the LNP's going to keep voting against $10 billion when you need housing. Now, if that's not evidence of somebody who is using minority influence in the Senate to hold up a government and hold a community to ransom, I mean, I don't think most people would think that's what they're voting for when they're voting for Greens. And the same bloke he got caught out the other day, he was on about airport noise. The only time he's contacted the airport since he's there is to get his valet car parking. So I think these small parties like One Nation, the Greens, we in the major parties have a lot of responsibility for them popping up because people have said, bugger you lot, we're sick of both of you, and there's no differentiation between the two of you. And that now, in my view, is where politics has really got to come back to what I call backyard politics. You have got to be able to get to people where they work, where they frequent, whatever it is, where they interact, whether it's at a pub or whether it's at the pokies or at the bowls club or wherever it happens to be, in and out of schools where kids are. And politicians have got to get back into that, and they'll be the successful ones. And I've got to say, most politicians are like that. Lazy politicians don't last. People wake up to them after a period of time, and I've seen enough of that happen. That it's the only job where you self-regulate, really, as a politician. You could not go to work, go to Parliament for 4 years if you wanted to. There's not much that you can do about it. As we've seen with some people that, they've just bludged their way out of in the last term and done absolutely nothing, turned up to Parliament when they felt like it, like Palmer did when he was there. He turned up when he felt like it, but they didn't vote for him the next time around. And he didn't really want to be there. He just wanted to stir the pot up and say, look at me, look at me, look at me. And so I think that the parties themselves have got to make sure that they endorse people who really do want to be part of a community, who are prepared to go back into the party system and say, here are the problems that are confronting my community. Now, whether it's youth crime or whether it's a lack of job opportunities or whatever it happens to be, you've got to be able to fight, and you've got to be prepared to fight.
I think a lot of people will think about the representation that we have and say, is this the best that we have?
And I hope people do that.
And it's hard because these are people and they have lives and people would have said that of you back in the day, and we're here having a great conversation. Yeah. I think it should stir people to get involved and do something. Yeah. And
there were people who said they could do the job better than me, and they ran against me and did so. And that's what you got to expect. I mean, I remember saying to my father, I was down at the railway of all places, I said, and they're getting up me down there because government employees and the wage increase. I said, Christ, I don't get paid enough to listen to that. And he said, listen. And there was that occasion, the second one was, it was a polling booth. This bloke bloody roared it up me. And I said, that bastard, He said, look, he hates everything you stand for. He said, he objects to everything you stand for because he's a dyed-in-the-wool Tory, he said. And the day that he sides with you, the day you want to give it away, he said, because if you stand for nothing, you fall for everything. And I've never forgotten that. And he said, you know what? He might, but he'll respect you. You roll over to him. And I ended up with 75% of the vote. So a lot of people that identify as Tories voted for me at some stage. But yeah, I think it's something that you've got to be yourself as best you can without being too raucous, which I can be prone to do, and to, what's the word, direct, I suppose, to the point of being offensive. But I think also that you've really got to believe in what you're doing. And unless you get people who pull you up from time to time. And I remember once being out at the council, Brad Carter put on a sports day out at, so it was a Rocky Sport, what Rocky Sport Expo out at the showground. And I was in, this bloke come and called me for everything because the swimming pool was disgraceful. I said, well, look, we don't build swimming pools. That's a council. Yeah, just ducking for cover again. And so we had a really heated argument. Anyway, he said to me, I'm a bloody Labor voter too. I said, yeah, well, they all say that. My father was a whoopee. I said, I don't give a bugger what your father was. Anyway, it got really heated. But when I cooled down and he cooled down, after a while, he told me a few things about myself that I didn't want to hear. But there was another mate of his that was there at the swim club. So I went up and talked to him. I said, what's wrong with him? He said, oh, he's like that. We've become very good mates out of it. And if you go and have a look at that swimming pool over there, that's a creation of that conversation. Now, I could have walked away from that and said, I'm not going to do anything about that. But I actually found a way, because state governments don't build swimming pools, that's by and large. But at that time, we were doing the precinct for 30-odd million, well, about 70 million all up with the showgrounds, for that whole precinct for the riverbank, the Lake Memorial, all of those things are all my initiatives. Anyway, I went back to Cabinet, Treasury, and said, what if we could incorporate that in there? Can we ring fence it enough so that every other council doesn't say, you funded that pool? And we were able to do it. And we were able to get the council to put in money. And Kirsten Livermore was the federal member at the time. I spoke to her. So I think we put in 17 million or something, 14, 15 million or something. Council put in 2. I think the feds put in 5. And that beautiful swimming pool is a result of that conversation, which started as abuse. So it's an irony. But it goes back to what I say. It's about being able to be out there. And if I wasn't at that event, if I was at home laying in a hammock or down the pub getting on the scoot, I would never have known. But it's being where people are and hearing what their issues are and not being deaf. I mean, it was pretty, I give them as good as I got. If people had heard us, which they plenty did, they would have said, this bloke will never vote for me again. But he handed out a vote card to me and he came to my send-off. So,
wow.
So there's a story in politics that I think,
great.
probably a good one to end with.
I'm a huge fan of robust debate and the ideas and the values that we hold and cherish and believe in, fleshing those out through conversation with others, and a lot of division in the way that people view things socially, politically, whatever.
I don't think division's a bad thing.
Yeah.
Provided you recognise what the dividing line is, and if the dividing line is, in my view, unable to be repaired, and there's plenty of people in my life that I've said, well, I'm not going to argue with one more seat, because there's no point arguing with a monument. There's just, you're not going to get anywhere. But if there's someone who can concede points, well, you know that there's room to move. And I've had plenty of conversation with people like that over the years, and you walk away from those conversations. They can be pretty robust and sometimes quite angry, but you walk out of them and you say, well, that was a fair point. And if you, and I've had this happen to me recently with a chap who was died in the wall Tory, and quite offensive too, and it started about the voice actually. Anyway, we've ended up pretty good mates out of it. He hasn't changed his view, but he's not going to call me a lunatic because I support the voice anymore. But that was all right. I mean, I called him a few things you wouldn't hear in church either. But out of it, I've got a respect for him and he's got a respect for me. Now, I'm not going to change his view, but I understand some of his views and he understands some of mine. So I think if you get to that point, then respectful division is a fact of life. We are never, ever going to agree on everything. And why should we? Because we're all different. And the art of good life is the art of concession, isn't it? That we don't get it. What did the Rolling Stones say? You can't get, what is it? You can't always get what you want, but if you try to find, you get what you need. And I think that probably identifies where we are. And if we could get to that model where people say, and, I'm very hopeful for the future. I really am. I look around at a sea of really smart people like you and whatever, and I look for these people that the doomsayers say, the next generation is. I was just talking to a young bloke. Well, I had two experiences. One is my dog offended some people, and it happened to be a dog park, and so we just had a nice discussion about that. And I'm glad that they didn't have any. Well, they may have recorded. It won't be very nice on either side what happened there. But then I had a lovely conversation with a young bloke, and we were talking. He's working on the ring road, is part of it, and we were talking about he's doing geotechnical stuff and all that. Really smart bloke, and contrast with these other couple of clowns that. They might have been the former of what we were talking about, worrying about my dog, which is blind and deaf and bloody 16 years of age and should be on a leash and Christ knows what else. But anyway, he was laughing. He thought it was a big joke what I said to him, and I said, well, but he's 26 and he is using the most advanced. I started talking about my teeth and how engineering, and he's talking about board piers and so on. I said, well, that's what I have in my teeth. It's the same engineering. We got talking about engineering stuff, and he was telling me about his working on a school and they were boring these piers. And it was a really fruitful conversation, and he had a fair bit of metal hanging out of his ears and whatever. And I found him a charming, interesting bloke who contrasts these other pair of bloody whoever they were, I wouldn't dare say. And then there was another chap working there. He was there sitting on the riverbank, and you often find people, and he was in a pretty bad spot. And we got talking there, and I think that's what made I sort of. And then I went to an old mate of mine and took a cake around. And I said, I just had an experience here of the bad, the good, and the lame, basically. And that's something out of the Bible, isn't it? The blind, the crippled, the lame, or whatever it is, come to me, all you. Anyway, I just had that experience, and I thought, well, I'm glad I'm not in the job in some ways, but other times I miss it because I am going to help this other bloke, but the other young bloke, you just, as a politician, you don't get time to spend with those people so much. And he's my future. The other bloke's in his late 50s and he's had some health problems. The other two's a write-off. She's making finger gestures at me and so on, and he's telling me about my pedigree. And and I suspect they wouldn't be employed. I don't know, I might be misjudging them, but they look like bloody hobos to me, and they spoke like it. I guess I didn't speak any better back to them. But this young bloke thought it was very funny, an old bloke like me. He was just killing himself laughing, and I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation with him. And that's where our future is. Not with them, and not with this other poor bugger who's got all the, he's nearly my age, and that's why I say about the voice, what's going to happen in 50 years' time? Not what's happened in the last 50 or what's going to happen in the next 5, with all the climate change and all those other horrific problems that are going to confront the next generation. I'm very pleased when I see people like you, this bloke this morning. The world's in very good hands, and that's why I get out of bed every morning, and every day I find somebody like that in my life to try and spear me out of the depression that I sometimes get. So it works.
Well, you just answered my question. You're hopeful. Robert Schwarten's hopeful.
I am. Yeah, I'm
unreal.
I'm very well. I look at my own kids and I look at my grandkids, and I say, what is the world going to be like when they're my age? I can't even imagine it. I just can't even imagine it. But I hope that we still have a democratic system where people care sufficiently enough to put their name on a ballot paper. People like you, for example, who care about their communities and want to see good done for the majority of people, and to stop this creep that we're having of elitism in this country, where the rich have got considerably richer and the poor have got considerably poorer. And that's the big challenge that every government's going to have for the next 20-odd years, because the wealth that people have amassed, it's a terrifying figure that I heard it the other day, it's something like $150,000 a minute that people are getting wealthier at the level, and it's the same people getting poor. And it's worse now than it has been since basically the time of Dickens. And we used to be a pretty egalitarian society, and we're starting to become more like the American society. One great thing of this country is we didn't have a class system, but we're starting to look a lot like it now. And I don't like that, and I look to the future with great enthusiasm, because I see my grandkids as a product of their parents, and my kids as products of us who believe in a society that is fair, that is more equitable. Now, they've got a different view of various things than I have, but they still have that basic understanding. And I think most Australians, when push comes to shove, they want a fairer society. We want to retain our egalitarianism. We want our Carlton United Brewery to send a couple of cartons of beer over to the Poms and say, here, drink this English bitter. I think we want to have that as a society. We want to be able to crack jokes at our mates and be larrikins and so on. And I think we're going to do that. I mean, that young bloke this morning, classic example, I didn't know him from Adam, and he thought it was a great joke, this old bloke and these couple of young... I know what they called them. I know what I called them, but I'm not going to say it here. But he thought it was a great joke. He had a great sense of humour. He saw the funny side of it, and I can see the funny side of it now. I didn't at the time because they're picking on my dog. And I thought, well, I said to him, I said, I hope I run into you again someday in a pub and I'll buy you a beer. He said, never know.
Well, thanks for the chat. Thanks for coming in.
It was great, Levi. Thanks for the opportunity to
it.
talk. I really appreciate the opportunity. I enjoyed that. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Unreal.